Okay, welcome everyone. We're recording now, and welcome to this Reactivated session on self-assessment and mastery learning. We have a page that we typically show at the beginning of these reactivated sessions just to explain what we mean by that. And ideally what we have is we're revisiting the topic often a year or two after we delivered the first future teacher session on the same topic. And the idea is to have them more flipped, more focused on activities, more rooted in real experience with additional practitioners from new practitioners from what we had last time, and hopefully some practitioners that were here last time that are with us again today, and Dave Ford is a case in point who will involve in commenting later. There's a link there on the second part of this page that, and you'll have a link to this resource that talks about the journeys you created, and we'll talk about more about that later. Lillian did a bit of human analysis of what you said you most wanted to learn and share from attending this future teacher webinar.
Yeah, so it's quite interesting to see like people's interpretations and how they've changed a little bit over time. So although we have titled this self-assessment and mastery learning, I think the first time round people were more interested in the kind of quiz tools and things like that. That's fallen to kind of like that's become like a smaller number. I think more people are interested in this session with developing learner skills in self-assessment, ideas for effective and creative online self-evaluation activities. They're interested in the pedagogy and the inclusiveness of these, especially now that we've all gone online. How to encourage engagement with formative assessment. So lots of people, yeah, you design the formative assessment for the good of the learners, but they're not doing it, or they do it only just before the exam. And then how to encourage a growth mindset, you know, encourage freedom to fail, playfulness in learning. So I thought these were really nice themes, and we're definitely covering quite a lot of this, or Stefan's definitely covering quite a lot of this in his guest speaker slot. And we've updated a few of the resources, so we'll highlight that along the way. So then next page, Ron, just tell us your thoughts, experience, that link, sorry, the link on the page, the form invites you to go forward one slide, pre-session task.
Oh, that one. Okay.
Yeah, that's it, sorry. So just very quickly, looking at the kind of results from that. Oh, we should have called up the actual results. Do you happen to have that to hand? Otherwise, we'll just I'll just quickly run through the fact that actually there wasn't the main thing we added to this form was inclusion, and when we looked through the results of these. If we scroll down to the ones with the graphs, they're always a bit more exciting, aren't they? What excites you about self-assessment and mastery learning? Better results for all students are obviously the top thing that we're interested in. But also very high on the list was the attitudes of learners, changing the attitudes of learners. And it'd be very interesting if we actually bothered to measure that. I'm not sure how many of us implement self-assessment and then try to measure whether we are changing the attitudes of learners or helping them and their metacognition. I think some of the results were from a few years ago. People were worried about the time taken to create quality quizzes. But now, you know, we're a bit more worried about students refusing to accept responsibility. I know it doesn't show that on the chart, but it's definitely changed from our last presentation. So yeah, accessibility pros and cons, if we scroll down, Ron, not a lot of feedback from people about that. But it's certainly something we ought to consider a lot more now that students are online. And then, oh yeah, we're doing a so-called slide 7, Ron, if you don't mind jumping to a slide 7, to the information that we thought we just share with you the fact that, again, we did some self-reflection and looked at what we presented to you last time. And we've updated this a tiny little bit. These still stand. They're still like the underlying key things to be aware of. If you've not viewed it, please do access the learning resource afterwards. And then key readings, I thought I've brought in 2 or 3 key readings that are quite informative for today's audience, just to update your thinking about what works. So I found this article on using self-referential or ipsative feedback to motivate and guide distance learners. I thought that was quite relevant because these people are this is Open University. They're used to dealing with open and distance learners, and we're all having to cope with that for the first time for some of us. So that's quite important and useful. And it's got a very useful form that you could implement. You could update that and use it and apply it in your practice as well. And then combining the formative with the summative, that was one of the key things that people wanted to find out about. And again, Suzanne Vogel's talk that I attended at the last Assessment in Higher Education conference, that was brilliant. This method that she has of allowing students to fail safely or to just keep testing themselves until they feel confident before they take a summative assessment. That's a very nice model, and it's worth reading and finding out about it. So those 2 are relevant to higher education, further education, work-based learning, any context. And those 2 new methods, I think, are useful for you to consider. So yeah, I think a little update from Dave, I think, who was with us. He was sharing kind of the key things that people seem to trip themselves up on when they design self-assessment quizzes and things. So Dave, would you like to give us an update? You might need to unmute yourself.
And just for the background, we won't have time to go through all the individual bits that Dave showed, but we really do encourage you to look through the resource yourself, and we'll make sure that you've got the link to that resource. I'll pop it in the text chat in a second. But there's some really interesting examples that Dave's given there of different ways of assessing in kind of creative ways that are much more creative than a simple multi-choice.
I've unmuted you, Dave, but you've you've now only got a minute.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I couldn't unmute myself.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to just go straight over the same old ground. I think not a huge amount has changed from what I said there. Everything that I said before a year or so ago is all still very relevant. Nothing has changed massively. I think what is certainly interesting with what the COVID-19 crisis has shown is people's understanding of what online learning is very varied. A lot of places are just sharing videos of previous lectures and they're calling it online learning. It's only online learning if there is some sort of dialogue back and forth between the tutor and the student, and really if there is some sort of activity with some sort of feedback for the learners, I think, in my opinion, and that's where the sort of different assessment types come in. In terms of the different question types, and as Lillian mentioned earlier, when you set up a quiz or an activity, there's not just the actual questions, but there's the way you set up the parameters of the actual quiz itself. And I use Moodle a lot, so people will be aware of. You can configure the actual quiz in multiple different ways. So as Lillian described, I will often have quizzes that they can just repeat as many times as they like. I'm not going to limit them to just doing it once, because it is it is a learning tool, not an assessment tool. So it's giving people the skills, and the feedback to the questions is important. Then when they come to do the real assessment, which may be another quiz, a different type of quiz, or it may be a classroom-based assessment or an observation-based assessment, but the actual quiz activity that I'm setting up mainly with them is to help them to learn and be prepared for that. But a lot of people don't actually think about the different parameters of the quiz. Do you allow people to retake questions? Do you make them retake the whole quiz? Do you put a limit on the number of times? Do you have penalties if they get questions wrong? Those sorts of things. They're all considerations that have to be thought about and design the quiz based on what it is that you are trying to achieve and why.
That's excellent. That's really helpful. And not forgetting that the quality of feedback, and again, this is in the original, if you look back at Dave's original, feedback is really important, that people know why they got it right. If they got it right, know why they got it wrong if they got it wrong. But that's some really helpful, Dave. Thank you very much for that. Really pithy update there. So thanks a lot. What we'd like to do is just give you a chance to reflect on your own practices very quickly. We do have the Mentimeter. So the link for this resource is in the text chat. Ron's just popped it in there. If you open up the resource, we would like you to have a go. I'm just going to go over the, I'll just make sure that it's clear what it is that we're looking for in each of those. So what we're asking you to do is to think through different elements of your practice when you're working with students, trying to look at assessment and mastery learning and so on. So do you clarify what good performance is? So is it clear to them beforehand? Will they know, or do they only know from the result they get? So do you do that? Do you develop reflective learning? So is it is part of the process not just students knowing whether they've got it right or wrong, but also having a sense as to how they could get it more right and less wrong next time? So again, that's to do with the things that Dave was talking about there, how you set it up, how you structure it, also the scaffolding around it. So giving good info about the learning itself, you know, a clarity about what it is that you're going to be testing. Is this about skill? Is this about knowledge? Is it about core knowledge, peripheral knowledge? Does it encourage, or does your practice encourage teacher-peer dialogue? So when you're setting assignments or assessments, is one of your intended outcomes that they have that toing and froing either with you live or with other people, or indeed with your thoughts as recorded in a feedback loop within the system? Does your assessment process, your formative assessment, encourage positive self-esteem? And that last one, help performance improve. Sorry, it's not the last one, second to last one. You know, is it performance-based? Is it that sense of, you know, when you've done this, you'll then be able to see how you've done in relation to others? And then the last bit there, does the info, I've slightly worded that not very well, but it's talking about, does the information you get back help reshape your teaching? So the info that's provided from the assessments, etc., does that help you to reshape your teaching and think, I wonder if I could have done that better, or do I need to top up here? So very quickly, if you could just slide the slider bars to the appropriate place and press submit. And then we have a link where we can view the results. I also have a screenshot from last year. Oh, this is really nice. So from last year, the scores we had last year for that very top one, it was 2.5 for our cohort, in fact, two years ago. So that's gone up. Developing reflective learning, that's gone from 3 to 4.3. The other one, give good information, has gone to 3.3 to 3.9. So actually every one of those has gone up, but the one that's gone up most of all, looking at the original data, is those bottom two, helping performance to improve and providing info to reshape teaching. So well done, that's really helpful. And it probably reflects the fact that the people that do that kind of stuff come to sessions like this. It'd be interesting to know the other colleagues that aren't here, but that's excellent. Thank you very much. If we go to the next slide.
There's a question from Beverly in the text chat.
Okay.
I'm not quite sure. That might have been my shared screen rather than the actual resource. So, anyway,
yeah, I think we could resize the Menti so it's not so. Yeah, so we don't have to have 2 scroll bars on the page.
Right. So yes, yeah. Yes. Sorry about that. Yeah. So yes, it's a scroll bar within a scroll bar, which isn't ideal, but it does depend on the screen size.
And you can open the Mentee in a new window, which is why we always practice this, where we embed something, we always add a link as well, because I think that helps anybody who needs to, or is viewing through a mobile or a tablet.
Okay, I'm going to move us on, and I'm going to cut this next bit very short, much shorter than we planned, because we want to give Stefan the full amount of time that we planned for him. So this page is one now that you can access in your own time. We were going to kind of go through this in a little bit more detail, but there's an example of Alistair's Quizlet linked on the page, and another Quizlet from Judy. There's a resource that I created covering different types of interaction in the tool called Xerti that we use to create these resources. And there's an embedded Google Doc which you can read the responses from last time. But likewise, as this is a reactivated session, if you have tools that you use now and you would recommend, and that perhaps compare favorably with the ones that are already listed there, then you can open the Google form in a new window and post there. We were going to ask you to share your thoughts via the text chat, but I think we'll save time and allow you to do that afterwards. So instead of the text chat, you can open the Google form and either just refer to the tools and comments there, or add and contribute to it after the webinar.
Ron, are you going to just show people quickly that Xerti resource, because I think there's time to do that.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's fine.
Okay, so we have a Xerti resource here. If you don't know Xerti, it's a free and open source tool, high native level of accessibility. And this resource here is just a subset of some of the possibilities. And we unpicked some of the interactive pages that are most suited to self-assessment. So you can go through this in your own time. There's a little bit of an intro here that also links to the official demonstrator that we have on the Xerti website itself, and that includes something like 80 odd pages of different page types, but this one is a subset of that, like I say. And what will happen is, if you go through, this isn't real learning content, but you can explore the types of interaction and the types of pedagogy behind those interactions. So this is a demonstrator rather than real learning content, but obviously if you're not sure about elements of a banjo, you could learn from that perhaps. But there's a whole range of kind of stories and interactions here, and simple things like this, where it's actually, instead of just reading a whole page in one go, it's stopped and you as a learner click the button to see more, and that's quite a simple but very effective type of interaction. I'll skip through these. So there's lots of interactions, lots of different types, some of which are quite simple in terms of the learning that might take place and less challenging, and others are more challenging. And one of the most challenging in a way is just a plain text entry box, which you're asked to reflect. So if I find that page very quickly, not very interactive in terms of buttons and drag and drop and visibility and so on, but actually in terms of self-reflection, you're asked to type what you understand of what you've learned so far into an empty text box. It's a really powerful way, and you can see that there's a prompt there, and you can have those dotted through the resource, and therefore there's a model answer results page which collate all of those things. What I wanted to quickly get to, because we do need to move on, but at the end of this resource, we also have a results page. And what's been really popular amongst the Xerti using community is, although you can have all this and you can use SCORM in a VLE, or you can use LTI, or better still, even XAPI with much richer analysis, a very simple analysis that you can do and provide for a self-assessment and self-reflection resource for learners is to embed the results page at the end, and you don't really have to do anything as an author apart from add that. And then at the end, what you'll see is there's a button to download. So you as a learner, or your learners, can download. They can be prompted to add a name in there, and what it will do is create a PDF with their name embedded. And if I just save that and then open it up very quickly, you'll see that what it is a replication of what we had on screen, with the answers and so on. And so they can, as a learner, can revisit that resource and do that again and get a new results page, or you may even prompt them to share that results page with you as a tutor to be able to provide some feedback and so on. So there's quite a lot of functionality just in the kind of core feature set without having to use a VLE or anything like that. So let's go back to the resource.
That was good timing. Back on time.
Yeah. So I think one of the things that we wanted to cover from what people said about this session is this, some of the higher order skills, how do you get students to engage with the assessments that are set? And actually, more importantly, how do you encourage students to engage with the feedback after they have received it? So if we move on to this is available for you to view. I'm sure if we click on the example program learning outcomes, I was driven by this kind of like, a lot of us who might be in higher education have these complex learning outcomes that we want students to kind of get to, and they're really hard to understand. And students are saying things like, but the tutor always talks about critical and analytical positions, but I can't see those words in the VLE. That's a very kind of naive maybe approach, but that's where our students are. So we move on to the next slide, where we're kind of looking at really, no. We are going on to like a slide 13, 14. Yeah. So from that thinking, we were kind of like, how do you encourage students to understand what those learning outcomes are? So I guess the challenge from 2 years ago was, do people use what the Americans call a rubric, a marking guide, if you like, to help people understand where they are? When they are about to submit something, do you ask them to assess against or revisit the rubric? And the rubric should match up with your learning outcomes, hopefully. So on to the next slide. We covered off Jones et al.'s journal article that talks about these various steps for implementing good self-assessment activities. And we then added in, I added in step 0, priming, for the learning generative effect, getting students to kind of create their own rubrics, and then they can compare it with yours. But then we've updated it further now, where again, Hughes et al. 2014 is a big one for me now, where the students can do all this, but if you can't see it, you can't help to develop their thinking. So the form inside Hughes et al.'s journal article might be a really good starting point for colleagues who maybe haven't started implementing something like this. It's like a cover sheet. And before anything is discussed between peers or submitted for feedback, the students have to do this reflection that digs deep. And I think even better would be if students were asked to connect their learning from previous modules to feed into their current work. That would be even better. Okay, and that's me. So next up, I think we're going to introduce Stefan on the 22, I think his presentation is on. So Stefan works with me at the University of York, and he specifically has a cohort of students where I think self-assessment works very well for them, doesn't it, Stefan? I'll let you introduce yourself. Might have to make sure that he can.
Stefan muted.
We might need Ron to unmute him.
Well, you could both do that as well. I'm trying to find them actually in the list of participants.
All I have is a button that says ask to unmute, which is not the same thing.
Okay, I've found them. And Stefan, do you want to share your screen rather than?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, I can't share my screen while you're right. Yeah. Okay, here we go. Right, is my screen there?
Yep.
Right, brilliant. I'll make a start then. So, what I'm going to be talking about today is self-assessment and how it assists the learner. And I'd just like to start off with saying one of the best things a student ever told me in a class was that I was sat back drinking tea while the students were doing all the work, and it was great. So I laughed and said, you didn't see all the effort that went into it prior to actually me sitting back and drinking tea. So I think that's one of the things that we need to realize about self-assessment. There might be a fair bit of pre-work to do, but once it actually starts working, if it works well, you should be able to sit back and assist rather than stepping forward and teaching. So, right, how we develop the use of the self-assessment. And I think it's important to know who we are so you can understand where we come from. So what the IPC is a essentially foundation college where we take students from international backgrounds who might not have quite the academic qualifications that are needed for a UK-based study or need a bit of language top-up. So one of the most important differences that we see between our students and domestic students is that our students have got a lack of confidence in their ability to discuss ideas, concepts, even basic knowledge, to a point where if they are not 100% sure of what they're talking about, they will not provide an answer at the very beginning. Partly that is due to the culture shock. They're coming from often very different educational and cultural backgrounds where the expectations of their tutor are very much different. And also some of the learning expectations between their domestic education systems and ours are different. So for example, if you go to China, there is a high degree of reliance on subject knowledge, whereas for UK universities, subject knowledge is more expected and probably it isn't as important as the understanding of the subject. So, changes in approach. Well, pre-COVID, we did use flipped learning. We used Google Classroom quite a lot, focused on the key learning, and this was a tool to allow us to go into the seminar rooms, find out what students did well or didn't understand, and we'd be able to focus on exactly what students needed help with. This did actually go and aim at increased student participation because they had an idea of what the questions already were. They weren't going in blind. Once the students had gone through the basic knowledge, through self-assessment and the additional work that went on, there were lots of opportunities to use Google Classroom, so you could share work, you could share documents and resources, students could work together, and this small group activity helps to develop the confidence to eventually go back into larger class discussions and sharing their ideas with a larger group. So quite often what we do is, as you can see, there'll be a lot of interactive work on pretty basic systems, i.e. whiteboards, but to make sure that the work wasn't lost, we photograph it, upload it onto Google Slides, and then the students would have a record of all of their work post seminar. So technology was being used, however, it was probably being used in a flipped learning sense in a more basic way. What's happened post-COVID is that we're using a lot more flipped learning. So for example, our statistics team are using something called Numbers, which is a constantly evolving platform which they found to be incredibly useful. Not only does it allow students to do the work themselves, but it allows, I'll show you another screen later, it allows students to learn from it as well. We also use Blackboard, however, we found that Blackboard can be a little bit more difficult to use, and it also seems that the reporting functions aren't quite as good as Classroom as well, but that might just be because we've not found it out yet. We use different methods of feedback, so we use the discussion boards and the discussion forums quite a lot now from Blackboard, which is very good for distance learning. And we also have one-to-one feedback for student work. It should have been a different slide. Now, The main differences are there's less chance for informed discussion and we require more detailed feedback. So if you look at, for example, this is just a copy of the work that we've done with this module, you'll see that there's a lot of quizzes that students do. This allows us to see exactly what students have been doing, and more importantly, which students haven't been doing anything. And it also allows a quick overview to see whether most students gain the majority of the information. If you look at the SCORM and numbers, this is the type of feedback that a student will see. So if they've got the answer wrong, you are able to provide them with an explanation of the answer, so students will be able to work through it. And as was mentioned before, there's unlimited times for the students to do this work, so they can practice and practice and ensure that they get the right answers. Something which is quite useful for our students, as our students like to be very certain of their knowledge and basic understanding. So I think when we talk about how self-assessment can aid, it's tutors and students at the same time. It absolutely influences the pace of learning. If students understand what they are doing, they are more likely to be able to contribute to discussions, which is where the basic self-assessment comes in. This allows you to then understand as a tutor where your students are struggling and then rearrange your tuition or seminar classes to focus on those specific areas. And it also allows you to capture offline learner data. So for example, what students are actually participating in and what students are basically not participating at all and relying just on pure luck. It also aids in the assessments, formative, definitely summative. If you use the resources efficiently, you can scaffold questions through open and closed questions, which captures the individual evidence. So you've got a lot of reports which are pre-done for you, essentially. You've got all the information that you need. It simplifies the work at the end. It also, most importantly, means there's a reduction in workload. There's much less marking for you to do as a tutor. There's less data collation needed because the systems do it automatically. And you also have group analysis to show what you've been doing well as a tutor and what you need to focus on in the future to enable students to learn better. Now, how do you implement self-assessment? And I think it's very, very important that there is a balance between being interesting and being useful. So as a student, do you want to do lots of clicking yes/no answers? Probably not. But how then do you get the balance between it being interesting as well? First of all, I think it's really important that students understand exactly why they are doing their self-assessment. When you look at the work they do, make sure that students understand that certain vocabulary and terminology will only get them a basic level within Bloom's. And if you only do the apply, understand, remember, you're never going to get your higher grades. Students also need to understand what the trigger words are, the link words are, and also they need to understand where the grade boundaries are. This comes in providing mark schemes. And we have been quite proactive in using, I forgot the name of it, the mark schemes, but the American word. Can anybody help me out? Rubrics, that's it. We provide rubrics with all of our coursework where students can easily see where they've done well and where they have maybe not done so well, usually on the analysis side. So when you match Bloom's with rubrics with work, it absolutely helps the students to understand, and the self-assessment again is really important for that. So how do you make self-assessment interesting? Well, you can always use different theories, and De Bono, which is something that Lillian is quite keen on. It allows students to think about different perspectives, different ideas. So when you match this with different assessment techniques, you get a lot more involved and a lot less predictable answers. So for example, if you use Xerces, there's a function on there which allows you to have pathways for your answers which depend on what the previous answer was. So there is never a right or wrong answer. If you choose this option, this is what happens. So what this does is enforce the student to think about their answer and think about what the consequences of the open are, consequences of their answers are. Make sure that you use different problem-based learning techniques. And what this does, hopefully, is make something which can be quite dry and factual into a more open-ended process. And this is really important when you've got subjects like social sciences, where quite often there isn't a right or wrong answer. Any answer can be correct depending on what your situation is. It's really important that self-assessment is the beginning of a learning journey. Especially with our students, they are very keen to understand that they have got the right answer, that they know what the answer is, and it then will allow them to be more motivated when in the seminar sessions. Self-assessment, again, ensures that students should learn by themselves, and then you as a tutor are able to guide students using that knowledge in the seminar, which means that your seminar time should be much more fluid, guided by the student, and less guided by the tutor, especially on live sessions. I don't know if anybody of you have done live sessions online this semester, but it's incredibly difficult if the students aren't 100% sure of their answers. Again, have links to curriculum outcomes, so you signpost the learning, make sure that learning aims and outcomes are there, which means that if you do a self-assessment, if the student gets a question wrong, or even if the answer is correct, you can still link in the self-assessment of, this is what the question is, this is what section of your work or what section of the theory it relates to. It allows students to study that much better, especially when it comes towards the end of the semester and students are madly rushing to learn as much as possible from what they didn't learn prior in the semester. Again, if students are primed properly, this means that they are aware that you do not need to rely on the tutor for every single question, which again can reduce the tutor workload because you have less emails from students saying, I don't understand this subject. Students should be able to go and check a topic by themselves if it's signposted, which means that the questions that they do have should be of a higher level and you will be able to guide them better. Here's a simple mark scheme that we provide to our students. It isn't particularly detailed, but it doesn't have to be, because students need to have an idea of exactly what the grade boundaries are. Now, bear in mind that we're a foundation college, so you might think that some of the descriptors are quite basic. However, it's a very simple way of a student to understand why they have got a particular grade in their assessment. It isn't detailed, it doesn't use particularly high-level language, it is meant to be accessible, and it is meant to then allow students to think, right, I've only got one side of an argument, how can I do this better? And this is where self-assessment can come in when you are looking at different arguments. Again, depending on the level of your students, again, as a foundation, we think it's really important to ensure that students understand link words, how theory works in and how examples are necessary. And this is what you can see in the mark scheme, where it talks about different business concepts, balanced reasoning, and both sides of an argument. So, really importantly, how do students benefit? Well, what you need to do, and this is a really good website that I found, you need to ensure that students are engaged, and that is what we are currently ranking our students on. If you have good self-assessment, this allows students to test theories and ideas in privacy, which essentially is talking about personalized learning and student-driven learning. You are able to give specific feedback on main reasons for errors. So, for example, in social sciences, you might not be able to give a specific right or wrong answer, but you will be able to highlight some of the key reasons why an answer might be successful or might not be. So you might give them an exemplar to gauge their own work on, and then refer them to the mark scheme to, again, go and mark their own work and find why or how it can be improved. It's really important to ensure that there are multiple attempts to understand the problem. So revisiting your work, it's important to have multiple viewpoints. So this acts as the competency-based learning. What areas are you thinking about? Where do the different theories come into it? What this does is hopefully build confidence in the base level understanding. And again, this is very key to our international learners. They need to be confident, but sometimes I think we forget that our native learners, we give them a lot of information in the first years, and quite often they don't know what information is important and what information is nice to know. So by using these self-assessment techniques, it allows them to focus on the ideas which are important and allows for the preparation for discussion in seminars, which then means that the basic elements are done in self-assessment and the students are then able to develop their answers and show their knowledge of critical analysis, critical thinking, and this is where you boost those elements which William was referring to earlier. Last of all, it should make learning unique because there shouldn't be a right or wrong answer and students are given more personalized feedback. So, some basic student observations. Student take-up depends on whether it's a new or existing method. If it's new and you can embed it at the beginning of the term, it's more likely to work. So it is really important that come September, this is a key element of the work. Students love having the explanations to be able to self-reflect on. So if you give them a good model answer, they can go and, as we've been doing here, go through it themselves. They've been telling me where the answers are. For definitive answers like maths, you can compare results against previous cohorts. However, it's really important to realize that we've been looking at comparing current and previous cohorts. However, there are so many different factors at the moment which are influencing the offline learning, such as open book exams, that it's really difficult to compare like against like. For subjective and open answers, it's really important that there is a level of expansion provided, which basically means you allow the students to mark their own work, find out where they've done it wrong, and most importantly, link your self-assessment to peer work through discussion forums or whatever it is on Moodle that you have. And this hopefully builds student confidence, which is most important. And that's the end.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Stefan. I think you've generated quite a bit of interesting discussion in the chat. And one question from Mike was on your practice there was that difficulty of using something for summative if you don't know they got help. Now, I think this session is meant to kind of focus on the kind of self-assessment and the benefits to the learner, but because I think one of your slides touched on how these methods were helpful for summative work as well. That's triggered a discussion about summative work. What have you done? Have you done anything differently for summative work now that we've moved online?
Unfortunately, due to the way that our assessments are written into our course descriptors, we've had to, even though it's perfectly multiple choice questions, for example, or simple questions like that, we couldn't really change them due to our course outlines. Going forward, though, it's changing the multiple choice or the simple answer into developed understanding, which is more difficult for the students to do. And it does, there is we are aware that there is we've changed it to open book, so we kind of expect a better level of answer. But so it's really difficult, and we're still struggling to get the balance right between accepting student work which looks too good, but then also understanding that it is good because they've had more time to compose their answers and think about their answers rather than being stressed in a 1 or 2 hour time slot. So.
Yeah. So you're having to recalibrate your expectations as well because it's a different form of assessment.
Yes.
And students are using a different amount of time to address them. And so I think we're all facing that same problem. And as well with mental health, where you give students 24 hours to complete an assessment that's supposed to take them 2 hours, but they're spending 24 hours at it, which is unfortunate. And again, that brings us back to this idea of like, how do we educate our students to realize that the assessment isn't the be all and end all of learning. And maybe we do need to have far more smaller formative assessment points, not formative maybe, just converting into more smaller summative assessment points. But I don't know what it's like in FE, but in HE, that something like that takes a lot of doing. You know, module changes, you can't just change it overnight. So and some people have volunteered some really good techniques for open assessments, where you ask the students to compare their submission with an expert, in inverted commas, an expert answer. So that again puts in place that self-assessment, and maybe it's the self-assessment that you mark, because that's a much more original answer, and you can do this in multiple cycles to help a student develop their ability to compare what they write with another person's work.
Yep.
So that's all very good. Just very quickly, thank you very much, Stefan. Really kind of thorough, giving us lots to think about. Lovely to see inside someone's practice. Just to say, this mind map that we developed a couple of years back, we've now just added the couple of ideas from this delegation about playful learning. There's a link in there on playful learning. There's a link in there about going beyond feedback, you know, and implementing this idea of students self-assessing and using that feedback in their future work. So a bit of feed forward and using that feed forward as well. And I think that's us for the kind of core material we wanted to cover. I think we should let Stefan view the chat because he hasn't had a chance to do that yet. And while he's doing that, we'll just introduce the next few slides and then carry on some discussion in the chat.
Okay, while Stefan's responding to the chat, and I think there's a few questions from Mike Ward that you might want to respond to, Stefan.
Yeah.
I think you already have. Just a very quick note that we have on the page that I'm showing now, we have a whole series of journeys to complement these future teacher talks that we've done in the past, and the same topics that we're covering now as well. There's a range of different journeys created by us and the wider project. But more importantly, if you're interested in self-assessment of your own kind of understanding and application of those topics and pedagogies, then we have what we called a thermometer and compass to effectively self-assess yourself, or to assess where you are at the moment, and then follow those little mini courses or journeys, and then repeat that process and see how the analysis changes and how the results change. So it's effectively a round trip of self-assessment, learning, application, and then repeating that process. So that's all available to you, and the guide here is how to go onto that site. It's a VLE called PEDIT, a Norwegian virtual learning environment that you might want to explore, just because that's a different VLE to what you've become accustomed to. So there's a step-by-step guide to how you sign up for that, register, and then how you access the individual journeys. There's a page about the three of us, Alistair, Lillian, and myself. And if any of you are from organisations where you're stretched with support and you want to follow up some of these resources and topics that we covered, then we'd be keen to hear from you. But everything's available for free. And as you'll have seen, the resources where you registered for the webinar covers all the topics and all the previous recordings, and we're adding the new recordings as we deliver each or repeat each webinar. A reminder that you can sign up for our mailing list, which is a very low traffic mailing list, although we would like people to reflect more and share more on that mailing list. So it's not us sending out information apart from announcing the next webinar and so on. More, we would like it to be interactive between the community, and I think we'd like to see more of that, and your reflections after this session we'd be keen for you to share. There's a final page in the resource about the tool that we use and why we use it, and links to the resource, and it's all shared under Creative Commons. But we have one final activity that we ask you to do, and that is to reflect either in the text wall activity that you're seeing on the screen, and I'll put the link direct to that page for those that signed in late, so you can complete it at your end. Or you can just put the message in the text chat if that doesn't work for you. What we often have is people will type and hit submit, and then it doesn't appear, and so they submit again. And there's some guidance on the screen to give it a second and then click to return to the message list to view the responses. So we've caught up with time, I think. Alistair, Lillian, is there anything you want to recap? Because it looks like we've saved a little bit of time by rushing through some of that.
Yeah, but it's quite nice to see the chat in the text chat. And I think, Stefan, it'd be lovely if you want to kind of just verbally, or if Mike would like to take the mic and just see if any other questions.
Well, on that note, when people have said they can't unmute themselves, this is a result of Zoom improving their security, or perceived security anyway, that now that's blocked as a default. But I'm going to tick the button to, quite dangerous I suppose, allow all participants to unmute themselves. So if anyone wants to pick up the mic, you now can, and I can see Mike has.
Yeah, I still am confused, and I always have been confused about the difference between competence and mastery, because you know, in NVQ type qualifications or practical work, if you're competent at doing something, it means you've mastered the learning outcomes. So I would love to have somebody explain the difference.
I think this isn't me as an expert at all, but when we talk about competency frameworks, it shows almost like a rubric where you're on a you're on a level of steps towards total mastery. And when you're in the mastery mode, you are able to explain to somebody else. And that's normally, in a lot of competency frameworks, that's where we would judge that someone is able to explain something to somebody else. And I guess in higher education, they use the essay very much as a way of seeing if that is the case, if that is true. So that to me is the difference, or the way they work together. Does anyone else have any ideas on that?
I'm interested. I'm really interested in the semantics almost, and maybe it is just a question of semantics, but I'm just thinking, if I was to be operated on, would I rather be operated on by a competent surgeon or by a master surgeon? And maybe in that respect, I think, you know, you can hit competency levels with things, but the thing that I always kind of wanted for my students was that they, in a sense, would overtake me, that they would grasp something and be able to ask hard questions that I would struggle to answer.
Well, I want a colleague whose definition of somebody getting, you know, a certain mark was they did it better than him, and he was told that you couldn't do that at undergraduate level, you know, at PhD level. So I think when you have learning outcomes and people have to achieve the learning outcomes, you know, this is a definition of competence. I mean, you're going to get to the things where you say, well, is somebody who got a first class degree, you know, or is it a master's degree? I know it sounds semantic, but if you're competent at something, I mean, for example, your example of a surgeon, you know, yes, you're going to get the top consultant who, you know, but the consultant trains the junior doctor to do the operation, and he wouldn't allow the junior operation, or she wouldn't allow the junior doctor to do the operation unless they were competent.
I think it may be worth having a look. I don't know, Ron, you've still got the screen handy. Right at the beginning, on the original session, I think it was it might be overview of the theme, number 3, I think it is possibly. Yeah, so there's a few slides there and they've got notes in the notes field. I'm not quite sure how you pull up the notes field. There we are, excellent. This is a simple framework we put together 2 years ago when we were kind of working through this, because we recognize that there is this range of, is mastery learning, on the one hand, mastery learning is about knowledge. It's about, does my student know the right terminology, this, that, and the other. But at the same time, there's also that whole skill element. So we've tried to unpack that a little bit. Now, again, you know, it's our attempt at unpacking it, or my attempt at unpacking it, so it's not even that official. But that may be worth having an exploration there. And anything that you think you can add to that, let us know. Because
I mean, I would personally define, you know, mastery learning is ability to learn independently, whereas competence is, you know, you need somebody to teach you.
That's a really interesting approach, actually. Yeah, and that could apply at lots of different levels as well. That could apply, you know, at MVQ, at A level, at any level.
Mm.
I mean, as you said, that's partly semantics. If I remember rightly, a lot of the kind of teaching textbooks and whatever, they refer to mastery learning as a teaching technique as well, where actually it's the technique of basically teaching and ensuring that everyone's moving along at the same pace and reaching the same point before you move on to the next topic.
Ron,
I'm remembering that wrongly, but
Ron, if you
Yeah.
move to the next slide, Ron.
But I think that's impossible. We had a discussion with Alistair about blind students taking longer to learn something because of, you know, it just takes them longer.
Yeah, I think another point to introduce, and I'll come back to what Mike was saying about a blind student as well, but I think we're also working on the verge of this idea of making sure that students revisit concepts like a spiral curriculum, which doesn't exist very much in higher education. It's a pity. But that spiral curriculum, so students are revisiting things and feeling more and more confident with the material they covered in the first year because they're asked to bring it into the second year and so forth. And by the time they come to a third year, it will feel like basic information to them. And that is a level of mastery learning, if you like, that maybe we don't do enough of in certain sectors.
There's some, sorry to interrupt, I didn't mean to talk over you. There was a gap in the transmission.
Please go, please do.
I was just thinking on the screen here, again, this idea when Ron was talking about, you know, how is mastery learning defined as a teaching technique? There's some nice examples here that the 3 groups that Anania, Bloom and Burke looked at, and again, you can go back and look, it's in the resource we've given you. The control group, a big group with so-called mastery learning, regular formative tests for feedback, individualized corrective instruction, etc., and then one-to-one. And the results they got were really very significant. So the control group got that normal distribution of marks that you expect, but the big group with the mastery learning and the formative feedback, etc., that the average there was 84% better than that in the control group. And then the one-to-one was, as you would have expected, even better. Now, again, there's links there to further reading with that, but the Education and Training Foundation, which is in the research section, page 7, in one of the tabs there, they've done some interesting work on mastery learning. It's under the key reading in the middle tab, I think. Yes, the research evidence at the top. So again, if you wanted to kind of look, because there are these different, you know, probably different definitions depending on which part of the education sector you're in, but there's some very interesting research there, and the Education Endowment Foundation does some quite objective testing based on, you know, meta-analyses and all sorts of things. So
in an article, they do question it. They say, you know, it is, the jury's still out.
I think a lot depends on the quality of the feedback that's being provided. And I think Margaret made a point earlier in this session about, you know, the time taken with marking. I think when you automate the marking, very often the tools that we use allow us to just say yes or no, and not necessarily to give high quality feedback. And I think that's going to be a big variable that isn't always easy to control for.
I think something that I've learned, again, I'm wearing a different hat as an examiner for Cambridge, is the feedback that if you have a rubric with standardized comments, you can actually make those standardized comments quite personalized with drag and drop features, and that's something that we don't at university do particularly well, in my experience. There's a lot of difference between what different tutors will give us feedback. So I think that when you're doing the self-assessment, it is the actual feedback that you give back which is more important sometimes than the work that the students have done or the questions that are set.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's worth standardizing between your markers so they have a session where they all see what each person would say as a reply to a student, and have this normalizing exercise so that students aren't confused, because sometimes students will compare the feedback that they've got back from different tutors between them. So, you know, you would hope that people try and kind of allow time for markers to kind of normalize some of their feedback, or to kind of blind marking, having a second response to try and normalize some of that.
I mean, Pearson's make a big claim that you should use AI as they do, because then it's all normalized.
According to yes, according to whichever biases they've taken on. We are taking people into lunchtime, or possibly into their teaching or whatever it is. So I think we probably need to stop the recording at this point. We normally are happy to hang around for 5-10 minutes. For those that would like